Okay.
So let's see.
Okay, the recording has just begun.
Okay.
So, all right. So we're going to be talking to Allison Webster Gibbons, professor in weapons, robotics, and controls engineering, and Dean Catherine Cermak, who's one of her many special areas of focus is assessment. And we're going to be talking a little bit about assessment criteria, both in ABET and in other departments. So thank you very much for being with us. Turn it over to you, Allison.
Okay, thanks very much, Karen. I appreciate that. Here we go. I'm sharing my screen. We'll wait for that to come up. Catherine and I wanted to present just a little bit of a structural background for interdisciplinary ethics that are unique to teaching in higher education. There are really sort of two elements that drive us inside of our individual disciplines. One is this understanding of ethics within a profession. And there are a number of different sets of elements that define a profession. And so I've come across this one, which is rather simple, but it embodies most of those elements. One is that every profession has a systemic body of knowledge, and that there is some process by which individuals who desire to become a part of a profession must go through in order to join that community. And that's where that authority and credibility come into. And then further, that the community itself acts as a sanctioning body of both positive values and positive actions, as well as negative ones. And so that the community is willing to take sanctions to do that, to praise and to counsel. And then the fourth element is that every profession has a code of ethics. And they are usually very explicit in that they are written down. And then finally, the fifth one is this professional values and norms and symbols, which are used to communicate what those elements of the profession are. So I think that that's important, because as we talk then about common elements within those codes of ethics across all of disciplines, I pulled out these as I looked at all the different codes of ethics that might be applicable to your individual disciplines. And the common elements seem to be these, that there is a sets of standards or codes of behavior. And so those are things that within the discipline that the community expects to have happen. And that the code of ethics establishes a system and supports that system of integrity with consequence. And finally, that the code of ethics develops a sense of belonging to that well-regarded community. So the well-regarded community is part of the motivation to do good things. And then the sense of belonging is a part of human behavior, where if we feel a strong sense of belonging, then we are more then we feel a part of that community, and we are more willing to behave in that manner in which the community wants us to behave. So as we're thinking about educating students not only in the technical aspects of our discipline, we're also encouraging them to become, or at least to understand, who the professionals are within that discipline, and what it means to then be a professional. The next element, which is really unique to higher education, is the accreditation process that we go through. Yeah.
Can I just step back? So
sure.
The understanding professions is very near and dear to me as a sociologist. This is very similar to the definition that's provided within the sociological subfield of professions. The only addition that I would make to it is that professions are seen as contributing to the public or the common good.
Mhm.
And so from that sense, having a code of ethics and holding each other to those standards becomes very important, that professionals are working at something that's larger than just themselves, differentiating themselves from other careers that are good and important, but not necessarily setting themselves apart by how they make the world a better place. So just wanted to include that.
Yeah, really great point. And I think another element is that professionals have the ability to discern um, uh, on the types of work that they will do or the clients that they may accept. And that's a part of the well-regarded, is that professionals do not, because they have the ability to discern, therefore they must make those decisions, right? So that they do work, they do good work. Yeah, excellent point. So I think that's a good place to pause also, is just to see if any others have, if you have any thoughts on ethics within a profession.
I'd be curious to know that within your own professions, um, what you've seen in terms of ethical codes and standards being maintained.
I can jump in, maybe. um, so I would say that there's both the notion of ethics as they concern research, and then ethics as they concern sort of the development of our brains as scholars, so to speak. So in terms of like professional ethics, because political scientists study human beings, in most cases, we have to have, if we want to publish anything, we have to have a human subject review. And that process is something that's taught even at the most basic level to any of our students who are going to be engaged in research, whether it's through the honors program or it's through the capstone that they'll do as seniors. They have to kind of, I mean, it's sort of eye-opening for them that they would think that, what do you mean there's ethics involved if I ask so-and-so a question, or I ask them this question, or how do I sort of shape the research process by my own ethical frameworks? Anyway, so all of these things are sort of taught there. And the second side of it is just sort of thinking about the global community and the US military's role within it, and their own individual role within it as future leaders. And all of our classes present puzzles or paradoxes that require, there's no right answer. It's going to be a deliberative process where we think through all of the different sort of options that are available, the constraints, and then trying to design courses of action. And I always say to them, look, the stakes are low right now. So let's like err on the side of being as sort of wild and experimental as we can, and try to solve this problem, understanding that in the future you're not going to have this kind of freedom, and you're also not going to have, like, in some cases, time to decide. So I would say that in listening to everybody speak today, I've had a lot of sort of resonance with the kinds of things that I do in my class, and that I know my colleagues in political science are doing. And we do have specific courses, like we have a political philosophy course, we have an ethics and international relations class, and just to kind of throw those two out, where a lot of the same things that are going on in LEL are being reinforced and challenged with more sort of political focused questions. That's it.
If I could jump in as a historian, probably one of the biggest ethical issues is plagiarism. And I take it very seriously. When I was department chair, I actually had a colleague accused of plagiarizing material. There are some very well-known historians who have won national awards whose previous work was plagiarized. And I bring this up in my classes. One of the best examples I've used, talk about bad luck. a book review. The man who was reviewing the book saw some disturbing similarities between what he was reviewing and his own dissertation. And he put them in parallel columns to show that this scholar had plagiarized his dissertation. There were no citations. And the plagiarizer lost an endowed chair. The book was pulled by W.W. Norton, and it has taken him, this was in the late 80s, until now to really rehabilitate his reputation. Fortunately, in my time at the Academy, I think I've only had 2 bona fide cases of plagiarism. Usually it's just ignorance of paraphrasing. You know, if you're going to give me a citation when you paraphrase, when it's wrong, you're not trying to deceive me. But it is a real issue in the historical profession.
Excellent. So that brings me then to sort of the other structural element that's unique to our higher education, and that's accreditation. And certainly, as you're all familiar, that the institution, the Naval Academy, is accredited by Middle States. And then science and engineering is accredited by both the American Chemical Society and ABET. And ABET has a couple different subcommittees. I've outlined most of these in your read aheads, and I've given you some links just so that you, if you'd like to become a little bit more familiar. But both Middle States and ABET have within their accrediting process elements. Standard 2 in the case of Middle States for ethics and integrity, and criterion 3 for ABET within student outcomes, where they explicitly call out the necessity of teaching ethics. And we are asked to incorporate the teaching and then to document and explain how it is that we do that. And I have to say that within engineering, it's oftentimes a very difficult thing. And it's just a nod of, yeah, we had a case study in this one course and we spent one day doing that, which really doesn't give the strength of the curriculum that we could be giving to it. But it's difficult in the process of that. So I pull out those 2 elements for you as the reasons why, beyond sort of our own individual motivations, why we might want to have ethics within the curriculum. I really appreciated this quotation on the left-hand side under one of the Code of Ethics for the librarians was, this freedom carries with it the responsibilities of professional conduct. And I think that that sort of embodies much of what it is understanding what does ethics mean within the discipline and how do we communicate and practice that with our students. So I thought I'd just raise these 2 questions as a way within the next 10 minutes or so to have a dialogue to hear from you on, are there professional standards which you seek to address in your curriculum through this workshop? And then the other element is, are there any disciplinary trends within your fields that you feel are necessary or important for midshipmen to understand as you're moving forward? And if you have a thought outside of that, feel free to include that as well. So while you're thinking, perhaps I'll offer this. One of the things that we do in the engineering field is to help the students understand who are they protecting through their ethical decision making. And that's the person who is not sitting at the table in their design process. And so they are protecting a couple things. One is the individuals, the general public, who might be harmed or helped through their design solutions. And then the other are sort of the use of natural resources and the earth itself And so what obligations do we have as engineers to incorporate those thoughts as we move forward?
Yeah, if I could add one. So looking at the Middle States criteria, they require that, consistent with our mission, that our general education program, so for us, our core program, include the study of values, ethics, and diverse perspectives. And when I first read about that, I think I had recently been speaking with Dr. Lunding-Prock about the American Chemical Society and their requirements to have an ethical component within the chemical education. And she had spoken to me about including a module on Flint, Michigan, and testing for lead in water. And I just, as I was thinking about that in terms of values, ethical perspectives, and diverse perspectives, I was really kind of thinking how rich this is, in that in Flint, Michigan, you could speak about it from a utilitarian perspective of, we're going to test at the location where the greatest number of people get their water source from. But if you're thinking about diversity with regard to this, what about those who are in more rural areas, which are often of a lower socioeconomic status? What about different areas that might be easy to skip over, where you're going to have racial groups that may be concentrated? And so how you make those decisions aren't just about, oh, well, we're going to make sure that we don't test from a place where we know we already fixed the problem. And I'm sure that our philosopher can point to other ethical perspectives other than utilitarianism that can be considered within regard to this. But I thought it was fascinating that our accreditor seems to put diversity and diverse perspectives right in there with values and ethics, that these things are connected and linked to one another. And I think that's something that, as I look at like inside higher ed and see what's going on at different professional conferences, if it's something that makes the pages of Inside Higher Ed, it's often a mistake that somebody has made with regard to diversity and how the profession chooses to handle those mistakes.
I was just thinking about, as in my field, one of the things that I think students, I work hard to get students to understand, and I'm not sure I've succeed, is in our period surveys, what we're doing is teaching the literary canon. So the works that the discipline has agreed are important, right? And the works that get anthologized, the works that get discussed. And one of the things that, when I was in school, there was actually the canon wars going on. People were really fighting about this. They're still going on. They're just less in the press than they used to be. And I try to get my students to see that the canon itself, what we're reading, is an expression of the discipline's value at the moment, and what kinds of things the discipline values. They're often shocked when I say, some of the stuff that I teach and that I require in my classes, there were no courses in which you could read them when I was an undergraduate. So these changes are rather extreme, and we talk about, what kind of values those decisions are based on. I wish they got more of it. I think they just see these things as handed down from on high. But it's a really good conversation to have.
I think kind of along those lines, we talk about this idea with of information privilege within libraries and database access, and what libraries are collecting and what's accessible to the public. How accessible is it? Who can access the information? Equity of accessing the information. There's just a lot of layers, especially with everything digitized, and what is easier to access and who can access that. So there's a lot of really interesting questions that have emerged within my field in that area. And it's interesting. I think we're trying to get students to engage more with that, not just, oh, this is the information we can access, but thinking critically about that. Who produced it? Where did it come from? And how is this available and not this other thing from this more underrepresented author? So there's really interesting questions in the information field. The other thing that comes to mind as a big area within libraries and information is privacy, patron privacy, especially, and this kind of relates with the data science piece too. What information are we collecting? Are people able to access things anonymously? So there's a lot of interesting applications in my field, I think.
Maria, I found really interesting as I was looking through some of the librarian websites that there was a discussion of the access to and the use of special collections, and thinking about that balance between making sure that people could have access and making sure that the same special collections are then available for the future and future users. So I thought that that was a really interesting element to think of, not only the present but the future and who would be using that information. Yeah. In engineering, we do a large amount of our work in teams, and so we try to help the students think about their work within a team in terms of ethics also. So how do they encourage voice? Whose voices don't naturally come forward, and especially as midshipmen, it's easy to have the loudest voice be there. But how then? How do they encourage those who might not want to speak up in the way in which the team is currently working? And that's important, because without having those voices, then we lose the opportunity to understand what alternatives might be presented. So it's not sufficient just to have a diversity of people on board a team, but it's important to then include their voice and their alternatives. Yeah. Well,
yeah, I think
ahead.
that what you said is really important, because I've seen with midshipmen in groups, it's sort of the one who's willing to stand up and speak, the first to the chalkboard, sometimes gets to decide what the voice was, regardless of what everybody who spoke had to say. That they sometimes kind of use that position to have a soapbox themselves, rather than to think of themselves within the leadership spectrum as speaking for their team. So it's kind of nice to see where in the leadership curriculum we can draw on to say, no, you have an ethical obligation, and it's part of your development as a leader to include this.
Yeah, and you can also tie that, I mean, just tying back to what everyone said, certainly in ethics, there has been a move in the last 20 years to move to include a lot of these things that maybe were not part of accreditation boards or even really theoretical ethical discussions 20 years ago. Issues like environmental justice and standpoint epistemology, which is a fancy philosopher's way of saying, kind of where you stand in the world is going to influence what you know, and the kind of perspectives that you can bring forward are really important. And one of the things we're trying to do in the slight changes to the ethics class is to focus a little bit more on those kinds of what you might think of as much smaller, what seem like smaller decisions, which actually may have as much, if not more, impact, especially as they get made over time and time again, right? That those are all ethical decisions too. They might not be the kind of thing that would make you a horrible person or put you in jail if you didn't do them, but they're an important part as well. All those things that people are mentioning.
The last thing I'll suggest is, as you're going through the week, perhaps listen and look for trends that one discipline might be addressing that you also might want to address in your own discipline, so that we take advantage of the 4 years of the midshipmen, so that they understand that plagiarism is not unique to history, that plagiarism can be also very important in engineering, and to reinforce those things. So I think that might be interesting to look at. So other thoughts at all on these questions before we close out?
One thing I've been thinking about is a lot of faculty have been talking to me and talking to each other about ways to address their students about, George Flynn and the protests and, or Floyd, I'm sorry, and the protests. And it's been interesting to me. People have felt like they've had to have that be like a separate conversation that they're having with their students in class. And so I've been thinking a lot about how, it's been a wonderful opportunity to engage with students on this topic, which is, at its base an ethical issue and dilemmas around reparations and social justice. Seems to me that we now have an opportunity to think about, moving these kinds of what I think, as people have described them, seem like very self-contained discussions into the curriculum in a more general way. And that feels like a very large and crucial issue to address.
Yeah, very much so. Excellent points. Well, I hope that as you go through the week that you, when you're developing your curriculum and your learning outcomes, that you think about the structure that these two elements provide, that you can draw upon them, both the codes of ethics that might be unique to your discipline, as well as the language that's in the accreditation provided on the references that we have provided to you. So that's all I've got. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Allison and Catherine. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we'll be back tomorrow.